Okay, well, hello and welcome to another cover seminar. Today we're joined by a new comrade, or actually not even not that new anymore because you've been here what was 6, 7 months now?
So fast since September.
Okay, we're having a seminar with Camilla. I'm not going to give much of an intro. I'll just say I'll hand it over to you, Camilla, and you can take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you everyone for being here, despite the change of time and all the, things. I am going to share this paper that I'm working on that I presented at the Historical Materialism Conference last year. And basically it sets out the kind of conceptual framework to think about new ways of understanding systems and orders, constitutional orders specifically, but it applies to all kinds of systems. So I'm going to share my slides. Okay. So the title of the paper is this Anti-Oligarchic Swerve. So part of my intellectual project comes from the kind of bottom-up approach to political philosophy and constitutional theory that is not only bottom-up, but is also anti-oligarchic. So against the powerful few, and how do we need to keep this always in our framework in order to move to to transition to another kind of organization of society. Okay, so and contrary to other forms of maybe socialist or communist thinking of the law and the orders, that it is goes against the grain of Marxism. I go back to retrieve kind of the origins of the thinking of Marx in Lucretius to grasp in a way the kind of dynamic logic that I see in his thought, and he kind of tried to portray in, and at least at the end of his writings. So the basis of the source of Marxist thinking of the Constitution and beyond was Lucretius and Epicurean thought in general, but Lucretius specifically. He did this doctoral dissertation, as I will go and see after. But basically, one of his main sources of thinking about change and what he calls a swerve is Lucretius. So Lucretius was a thinker in the first century before Christ, and he wrote this book called the Rerum Natura, the Nature of Things, which is a book that became very controversial, was very controversial at the time. And then when it was rediscovered in the Renaissance, was put in the index of prohibited books because it went against the immortality of the soul. And it questioned this idea of the permanence of the universe and a God, right? So he puts forward an atomic theory of nature, which is an idea, a theory of change in nature. And he argues that basically everything is made of matter and void, which we already know through scientific inquiry today. And for him, the matter are generative particles. What he says are the seeds of things. That basically things that can become something different of what they are and could generate new source of regularity. And then the void, which is the space of movement. Okay, so there is no movement without the space of the nothingness, in the in between, and it's this in between and the generative capacity of matter that allows for different combinations and a change within the patterns of regularity. So things are made out of this matter and void, of this kind of like clash of matter and void, and things have two particles or properties. One is the essentials that are essential properties of the thing, which Lucretius says, for example, is liquidity to water or warmth to fire, something like that, that cannot be taken away without changing the nature of the thing. And the other are accidents. And these are that contingency. And accidents for Lucretius are not just something that happens out of the blue, but something that is generated by humans, basically, that are artificial. So he's talking about accidents, about, for example, poverty. Poverty and war are accidents for him, something that we have chosen, that is artificial, that is not really natural, that allows for this kind of the interplay between matter and void to generate new particles in a way. So he identifies three kinds of motion. One that are connected to weight, to thrust, and to the swerve. So weight and thrust are based on the regularity that is allowed, for example, through gravity. Just you have a pattern and you follow it down, supposedly. The other one is thrust, that is based on collision, when one of those particles basically swerves and deviates and push against others. So these two sources of movement are determined by necessity. So we cannot really control them. Either there are patterns, or we kind of are reactions to that pattern and to the deviation from that pattern. Those are we cannot control. The third one is a swerve, and what he calls the free movement of things, and it is based on free action. And this is something that we cannot really explain. It is based on an accident and the kind of movement, the space of movement that we have to create something new, but it is something that it basically is the basis for voluntary action and free will in later writings. Okay, so for him, every new generation of things creates a regularity, a pattern. That creates a system or an order, and this order is bound to decay eventually. And from this decay and from the accidents that happened, we can have a swerve, some kind of innovative and undetermined action that it builds up. And when it builds up and allows for movement within this pattern of regularity, we have a collision with the other, with the order, and then we have a new generation of a new form of pattern. So from this kind of thinking, he develops a kind of what I believe is a dynamic form of materialism that Marx also believed it was a dynamic form of materialism, and it is based on some principles. One is the interconnectedness of everything. So this idea of the ecosystemic thought, that we are particles made out of matter and void, and basically we're all connected, and this is a radical interconnectedness, and not just kind of something that is one-on-one, the kind of butterfly effect in terms of change. Then that there is swerving that is spontaneous and is a non-determinative action. And then that there is the regenerative aspect of it, in which the corruption, this is the kind of an old word that I work also, the corruption of both passing away and coming into being at the same time, in a way. For the ancients, everything and every order has a moment of corruption in which it allows for metabole, which is the modification or the recreation of something into something new. So something is dying when something else is being born at the same time. So this regenerative aspect of this materialism is what is more interesting to Marx, and I think we need to kind of recover. So the other author that I see in this paper that is also another source for Marx is Machiavelli. So Machiavelli, also based on Lucretius and Lucretian thought and Epicureanism in general, and a mixture with more realist and materialist aspects of his own experiences in Florence, with law and power in the Florentine Republic. He also develops this theory, but it's a theory not of regenerative politics, but it's more about systemic corruption and the power that comes from below and maintains a free republic. So for him, all republics are bound, the same as Plato, by the way, all republics are bound to be corrupted, and every order, every constitutional order, all the rules that are in this order, we can think about not only about in constitutional terms, but also, for example, in artificial intelligence kind of frameworks, that all those frameworks that are based on principles and rules that supposedly are good cannot be maintained in a way. They tend to decay because of the freedom they allow, the freedom of action they allow, and the bypassing of rules that they allow within the system itself. It is a free republic after all. So there is a bound to be corrupted, and that in this corruption is not generic or is not general, but it always comes from the powerful few. So in a democratic republic, there always a tendency towards an oligarchic type of corruption, which is kind of the monopoly of the power or the overreaching of oligarchic power within the system. So the only way to prompt Republican renewal is to activate the plebeian constituent power, the power that it is the creative power that comes from below, and is the power of pushback, in a way, of resistance of the common people against the powerful few. So Machiavelli thinks about anti-oligarchic institutions and rules and mechanisms that would allow for what he calls a new beginning, or a return to the basic principles of the republic, and in a way create a system, a republic that would be dynamic in its own terms, in a way that has built-in mechanisms that would allow for this republic to be eternal or to be periodically renewed. And here, he devises in a very Lucretian fashion. He devises ways in which a republic can be a republic that is corrupted, like our republic today, that is captured by oligarchic power, to be brought back to its beginnings, which he means basically a balance of power between the few and the many, and the capabilities for the many to push back against the few. So he says that there are three ways in which a republic can be brought back to its beginnings. One is a virtuous leader, which is the most famous one in Machiavelli, basically a political authority that comes from leadership, that through either example or just sheer kind of force brings the republic back to its beginnings and rewrites, the rules of the game. The other is through a more systemic approach, which is through law, through regulation from within. So extraordinary law. Today we would think about a wealth tax, an extraordinary wealth tax that would override many of the provisions of constitutions that are protective of wealth, and therefore would be extraordinary, or an accident, an external accident. And here he means either, war, in our terms, war, climate catastrophe, something that is external, that basically brings the republic to its demise and opens the space for creating something new, to go back to the beginnings. So for him, what is triggering a periodic renewal are these new plebeian anti-oligarchic institutions through which the people can spontaneously push back and not kind of from within a system of regularity. So in a way, the challenge for Machiavelli is this kind of new institutions that would allow for this pushback, and this pushback not to be determined by the same patterns from which they emerge. Right. So for him, new beginnings again is triggered by virtue. This is the leadership, and the corruption that is brought by the sources of regularity can only be upended if there is an accident, and virtue can be exercised in that moment. And the people can act in that moment to bring the republic to a new beginning. And then the final author that I'm seeing in this paper is Marx, as I said at the beginning, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on Epicurean thought. And he was very much interested in Lucretius's materialism. And he saw the declination, the Kleinemen, the swerving of energies in a way, or these particles, as the form of emancipation, a self-consciousness that is able to escape necessity, an action that is not really utilitarian or functional in this manner, but really can escape the logic of the pattern of regularity from which it emanates. So for him, Lucretius points to the first scientific basis for human freedom, for free will, and is a non-theological way of freedom, or of a perfectionism that is not non-theological, but is dialectical, right? That is constantly mutating depending on the forces of the other end, and what are those patterns, and how the patterns of regularity are also pushing back. So the order and the kind of police state is pushing back against the swerving of energies within. So here I engage with the Marxist critique of the current constitutional patterns, the liberal constitutionalism that we have. For him, in general, constitutions, is the early writings, constitutions are sources of regularity that are created at a particular time and are a self-reflection of society. So therefore, constitutions are, in a way, reflecting the current dynamics of power relations, but are also aspirational in the sense that where is the society going to? You know, in which way are we oriented? So in a way, are expressions of what are the desires of the people that created that constitution in that moment in time. The problem is that whatever that constitution is, it will become eventually a straitjacket, basically, of that society, and would kind of fossilize or kind of petrify kind of the patterns, and they will be fixed. And for him, there are two forms of constitution. One that is the political constitution, that is based on a formal principle. So these ideas of in the idea and the principle itself, that is born out of abstraction, of a pre-existing system of thought. We can think about a socialist constitution based on some principles that are not really a reflection of society, but something that is more, as I said, aspirational, something that we can get to through those principles. And then the other is a material constitution that is based on the material principle emerging from the material conditions and life experiences. So we have kind of the formal and the material, and the gap between these two is what determine how what is the relation between the abstraction and the reality, but also kind of like the gap that we have to move in this swerve that I'm talking about. So for him, the only free constitution is the one that kind of basically fuses these two political and material constitutions, the abstract and the material, and this he names democracy. So we don't have a democracy today, and we didn't have a democracy back then, because for him, what we have today as a liberal constitution is based on the right to property, on the principle of property. And this, of course, it is a political constitution, not a material one, even though the material constitution is an oligarchic one. So we have, on the one hand, an abstract principle in which this of private property and ownership, which kind of organizes our interactions. And then we have a material constitution that actually is the oligarchic domination over a society that we experience day in and day out, right? So there is kind of a regularity there in between the abstract and the material. So for him, this liberal constitution is kind of the highest form of abstract thinking, in the sense that the private property ideology, this idea of the private property, as Hegel put it, this outside of us, and therefore we know ourselves through the externalization and the possession of something outside, becomes internalized. This idea of private property becomes internal, and it becomes to norm and bring a normativity to our own relations. And according to him, it subverts our understanding of justice. We believe that what is law is what is just, and what the law allows is what we should be doing, in a way, and therefore we don't have another referent of morality and any normative referent outside of the law. And everything is reduced to the law. And because the law is made based on the private property ideology and the oligarchic rule, therefore those laws will be aimed at domination, and based on kind of contractual relations of domination, as he describes. So, and here is a very important one, in which this kind of a form of constitution has inverted the principles, the human priorities, in a way, in which production and growth become end in themselves. In a way, private property has its own logic, which is the endless accumulation of wealth and the constant production of material life. And not that this production of material life is subordinate to human flourishing, which is the human, activity by nature, kind of the idea of the human being as a final cause and not production and profit as the end of the constitution. So this is a kind of a perverted form of a constitution that is very far away from democracy. So to kind of rethink and with this critique of Marx and rethink our own systems today, and how would we think about new constitutional forms that are not imposing again a new form of abstraction or ideology that actually can bring together the real and the abstract, the ideology, the ideal and the real. I take from an agricultural ideology that is based on practice, which is holistic management, and this idea that there is there are different actors in the ecosystem, and these actors, the same as the mixed constitution in Machiavelli and other realist thinkers and Republican thinkers, that there is a position for oligarchs, there is a position for capitalists, at least as I think for the transitional period into something new. I would like to think about this holistic management as the basis for interactions within the constitution, and a dynamic form of constitution that is always pushing back and forth in terms of the relative powers within the system. Okay. So first, that for holistic management, there are three types of actors in any agricultural setting: the predators, the prey, and the decomposers, which are, you know, the enzymes and the fungi and all the other elements that we don't see, but that they make all this kind of metabolic function in the system. And I would like to think about the predators either as the oligarchs or the capitalists today, and the prey as the plebeians and the working classes, and the decomposers as the filtering agents, which are the political class and NGOs and other forms of organized structures that are mediating between predators and prey, right? And the state as a kind of like a part of this filtering process or filtering actors. And the processes that are involved in the system, it has to do with water, resources, energy, and community. And of course, we can think about also in this kind of more political ways in which there are things that are necessary for survival, and labor and kind of food and water itself that are basic needs, right? The minimal conditions for the reproduction of labor, if we think about it in this manner. But also resources like natural resources. We saw it last week with the research of James that basically there's a new extractivist tendency even in data to go and extract data or resources from the global south in the same manner as the colonial endeavors back in the day and still today, right? You need to plunder these resources. So what do you do with those resources, and how do you do it, and how sustainable you are, right? And then we have the third element, which is energy. Where's the energy coming from? And we think about energy as, again, like food or money or, things that we need to keep moving, right? So we need to think about energy within the system and where is energy allocated, right? And then is the community resources and the community relationships. So not only that these different institutions or organizations that are quote unquote working class or plebeian exist, but what are the relations between them and among them in order to and how do they create a new actors within this ecosystem? So I put forward this kind of new framework to rethink the constitution in a even more encompassing way that is not about only law, but also about the organizations that are within and the power structures within. So I put forward this kind of regenerative materialism in which we cannot think about what we have now, which is very unequal, and what we want to have, which is super equal. This is the idea that kind of like our ideal, but we need to think about materialism in this transitional period. And for that, I highlight four ideas. First, this radical interdependence that comes from Lucretius and the idea of true democracy as having humans as principles, but not in an anthropocentric way, but as humans inserted in the ecosystem, as part of the ecosystem, as part of nature, and not separated from nature. So here I am developing a more kind of ecosystemic thought, based also on kind of like the jurisprudence of environmental politics and the reimagining of the commons. This is one of the issues that I'm tackling. Then the other issue, the other thing that I want to highlight is the contingent element. That is, we cannot think and we cannot base anything that's supposedly radical or is going to change the world from an idealist perspective, but we need to think from the radical material inequality that we already exists. So very different from liberalism and this idea of, Lockean understanding of the state of nature as a state of peace, right? That everything works great. I come from a Republican tradition in which there's no really in the state of nature. We're already born into societies that already are structured, and our society is of radical inequality. So we need to think whatever is necessary to change or to bring dynamism into the constitution from this radical material inequality. Okay, and then we need to harness the swerve. So the swerve is this energy, right, that builds up within the pattern and allows for creative thinking and alternative ways of being in community, right? So how to harness this kind of deviation from the pattern, this descent, and not suppress it, right? And harness it in a constructive manner that allows for adequate channeling of the energy in order to recreate the system from within. So how to build mechanisms and methods and rules and procedures, of course, that will allow for dynamism within the system and not for breaking the system and creating a new system, right? So this is like the breaking point that we all always dealing in our constitutional structures, that there's no kind of escape valve, if you will. We need to kind of have an escape valve that feeds into the system again in order to modify it. And the idea of metabolism, right? The idea of that we need this energy and this filtering agents in order to bringing this swerving energy. And finally, the most important principle of regeneration, this idea that passing away and coming into being are two sides of the same coin, and we always think of one or the other, but we need to think about them in conjuncture. So thinking about how about oligarchic overgrowth in general, like how it is happening, and how this is coupled with a plebeian inactive way of being, in a way, a passivity, and how from this oligarchic overgrowth we can turn into deactivating oligarchic power and enabling plebeian action. So both at the same time. So deactivation, and first a critical analysis and deactivation of the oligarchic power and an empowering of the plebeian side at the same time, and not one and the other, because that would not allow for a kind of the changing of the pattern, but just kind of like damage control on the sides. So this is it, the paper. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you for that. That was a lot to take in very quickly and very, very super interesting. I'm going to pause and then see who has things they want to ask about. And I see David David's hand went up. So David, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, thanks. Yes, a lot to take in. Very interesting talk, Camila. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it kind of resonated with stuff that I'm interested in, particularly building this kind of alternative basis or critique from the early Marx work. So I just wondered, maybe just to kind of directly pick up on that, what your take is on, the Althusserian critique of this break, structural Marx versus the humanist Marx. Just be interested to hear what your perspective is on that, for one, because you seem to sort of, I mean, and I agree with this, develop a kind of a view of human nature based on some of the early Marx and the authors that he was looking at himself, but not one that is sort of objective in an essentialist sense, but one that is based on an understanding of human activity and human nature, this sort of observational, if you like, or materialist. So I just wondered maybe what your take was on that, and then just maybe to just push a slightly more challenging question, based on what you sort of outlined there, of you know what constitutes the swerve and how it's different from other forms of activity. What would be your response to someone arguing that actually capitalism itself can be regarded as a swerve? So the development of capitalism as a constitutional form, as a mode of production, is this not an example of, you know, a swerve? And why is that a swerve that's problematic versus one that we maybe might want to see now, which I completely agree we would. So maybe that takes you back to this question of the kind of swerve and what's defensible and why. It takes you back to that question of human nature or human activity that's acceptable.
Thank you so much, Dave. Amazing. And yes, so Althusser, the idea of the paper is to actually engage with Althusser. I haven't gone there to write that part, but basically my take is that I agree with Althusser in general, but I don't think it is in Althusser in himself, but it's more like the reinterpretation of Althusser, which is kind of this radical contingency. And this is something that I do not agree, in the sense that it is what Lucretius and Marx are describing is not like everybody is swerving, right? We're all swerving and then it happens. No, it's actually, there's a pattern. Like 99% of the people go in the pattern, right? And then there is some swerving on the side, but that swerving is always kind of pushing back against the kind of hegemonic ways of being, right? And it's very difficult for the swerve to actually take over. It's not something that is, you know, we swerve and then we have something new, and it's kind of a little bit response to the idea of capitalism that I'm going to go into a little bit now. But basically, the idea that innovation and this kind of like everybody's swerving and there's like a radical contingency and radical conflict in a way everywhere, that the kind of agonism that is everywhere and not really a thing between the few and the many, which is what I want to bring back. And of course, Althusser has a kind of a plebeian grounding. So it's not like as I say, I have to kind of like go very more seriously into Althusser in what is actually he's saying textually, and what is the reinterpretation of Althusser as a more kind of agonistic theory in which there's radical pluralism, right? So I would say I would like to bring in a more plebeian understanding of Marx and Althusser than the kind of agonistic move, you know, interpretations of pluralism and radical pluralism in this way. So it's not very satisfactory, my answer, but there I'm going there. And then the capitalism as swerve. Yeah, this is something that I immediately would say that the capitalism is in itself a form of order, in which there's a lot of disorder within, right? But there's its own logic, right? So there is innovation within the system, but then there's no creativity or, you know, imagination or transformation. Everything that is innovative or the kind of like the creation and destruction happens within the logic of the patterns of capitalism. So anything that is really a swerve, it has to be grounded on emancipatory and an emancipatory thrust. And here are also with Althusser and basically Marx and Machiavelli as well, that you cannot, as the same as constituent power, other kind of concept that I use in law, that you can, constituent power is an emancipatory form of politics when you have an oligarchic republic. So if you are in an oligarchic system, which has always been throughout history, then all forms of real constituent power are forms that go against that structure and turn to emancipate those who are subordinate. So you cannot, and for me, it is very problematic in general that we try to apply, you know, words that are based on freedom and emancipation to a more generic, you know, form of, you know, things. For example, revolution. When you think about the capitalist revolution or, you know, the neocon revolution, for me, there's no revolutions. Revolutions are, again, something that is emancipatory, coming from the French Revolution, right, and other forms of revolution before. But when we think about, we apply that word to things that are not emancipatory, we're just, you know, bastardizing the term in a way, and we need to refer to other ways. So for me, capitalism could not be swerving because it is a pattern that is hegemonic. The only swerve is something that is counter-hegemonic. So that would be kind of a long answer to, the kind of way that I'm thinking about.
I mean, I see. Yakos goes hand up. So and what I meant actually in that question was just in terms of the origins and the development of capitalism rather than its systemic nature now, which obviously,
yes,
to argue your point. So, but maybe your response is kind of.
No. If that is the question, even more, because basically capitalism is another form of oligarchic political economy. Right? No. For me, it is. I'm not in itself a Marxist. I'm a Republican thinker or a Republican tradition person. So of course, oligarchic politics precedes capitalism, and capitalism is just one iteration. So it's part of the same pattern of oligarchic domination, right? A different, right? So in a way,
That's how I understood your answer. It's a progression of that kind of power. Yeah. Okay. I'll shut up.
Thank you.
Jaco?
Hi, thank you, Camila, for rich and really interesting material. I just had a thought about, or a question about the sort of the motivation, the broader motivation and aim of your project. Because in some sense, your Marx reading reminds me of some debates that were going on in the late 70s, say, British Marxists such as Norman Gerras and Scott Michael were really interested in defending a kind of an essentialist reading in the kind of human nature problem space within Marx. And some of the criticism that those people got in the 70s was that, we can find textual grounds for all kinds of interpretations in Marx, and his positions don't really deny human nature or a kind of Aristotelian essentialism. But it's still a different question of why should we pursue that project? So what is missing, right? So I wonder that how would you take on a question like that? That, in other words, what is missing from our understanding of Marx, philosophical, political, metacritical, if we don't follow your Lucretius reading? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. As you say, the problem with Marxism in general is that this reifying of, our own capitalist moment in a way, that right, the relations that there's kind of a very set way of looking at it, and only few people understand Marx as kind of a thinker of the swerve in a way, of change, right? It's more about capitalism and communism, but it basically as something that is not even spelled out, right? And the idea for me, especially communism and the society to be born, right? That society, one of the typical issues with Marx is that people say, well, he didn't say how communism is. There are some things, but he didn't do it because he couldn't do it. Like, there was speculation. And if you go back to Lucretius, how could he do that? If the swerve is something that we cannot, is spontaneous and comes from below, and it's happening, and it's being born, and something is dying, and we don't know what is going to construct. So we don't know how the new pattern of regularity will look like, right? So it is very difficult to think about a project in the future that will be based on a very hard kind of constitutional structure that this is the way to go. I think for Marx, a more dynamic thinker that, again, with Rosa Luxemburg and the more kind of anarchist tradition, in which spontaneity and action come from below and from the people themselves and the organizations of the people themselves in a specific society. So we have, the swerving will change or will be different from one locality to another. So we cannot have a set of principles or set of constitutions or whatever, or even relations of how things should be, if we're going to be real Marxist in a way. You need to have that interplay between spontaneity and what is actually happening on the ground and the principles that we have, right? So it makes it a way more dynamic type of thinker of the transition, and not so much of the end of, and we get, we can kind of move away from the more essentialist reifying reading of Marx, which is not very useful, I would say, and all the quibbles of, how purists argue in one way or the other. So I feel that Marx was way more, flexible than we want him to be. in a way, or Marxists want him to be. And that is based on, you know, the idea of the swerve as something that cannot be controlled, that is spontaneous, and it links it way more to Rosa Luxemburg than other strands of interpretation. I don't know if it's satisfactory at all.
Okay, thank you.
Peter.
Hi, Camila. No, I have you know, obviously, I really love this paper and I love what you're doing with this. I mean, my question is a little bit, though, about how the notion of the swerve avoids what I think has been a problem of post-Marxist theory and contemporary anarchist theory, which is the fact that there's this kind of idea that we're moving away from essentialism and we're going to wait to the, you know, whether it's discursive antagonisms or kind of occupying, prefiguring things. And what we have found is that the capitalist order is very good at either siloing these, marginalizing these, or really co-opting these very easily. And if you look at, you know, I think someone who's kind of both of our here, and that we both touched on, like Rosa Luxemburg, there was always that tension between the kind of spontaneity that she spoke about with, you know, she was very committed to having a very disciplined revolutionary party. And, you know, I think there was a real tension there, though, on the other side of that, in which she may have, I think, rejected Leninism without necessarily recognizing that maybe her project couldn't escape the tensions of the fact that the very thing that she needed to do it meant that it couldn't be spontaneous anymore. So how do we construct an idea of the swerve that also is very much linked to what I think we recognize are, you know, very, if not disciplined, but very organized, coordinated movements of non-domination, revolutionary change, right? And I think that's a fundamental paradox and tension that I'm not sure in the 21st century we've escaped. So I wanted to get a good sense of that, because I know that both of us, and we've spoken about this before, I mean, we're not post-Marxist in this sense. Like, we're not trying just to repeat some of the problems that happened in the 1980s and 90s, going away from essentialism. Like, I think both of us really would like to reinvigorate a kind of very deep Republican anti-oligarchic revolutionary movement. So how do we do that with the notion of the swerve and not just kind of repeat the fact that we don't want these to be just isolated things that can be easily co-opted?
Thank you for the question, Peter. So one thing of the swerve, and going back to the previous question also, is that when you have swerving and kind of innovation from within and kind of alternative counter-hegemonic practices and spaces, is always a society in the making. So through praxis, there are, you know, rules and procedures that are embedded in how we act, right? And part of Luxemburg's understanding of the party, as you say, is very disciplined. However, is based on the practices of the Soviets, in a way, of the councils. So for her, the main aim of the party was first to go to see how these circles behave and the practices that they have, and then systematize that. So in a way, create a kind of a framework that is not based on me or her or whoever that is thinking about this, but actually emerges from the practices that are actually ongoing of the particular swerve of the particular moment, right? So we have a relation between the spontaneity and the inner workers in the contingency in the actual ground, and then the kind of formalizations of this in rules and procedures that can be generalized and can become kind of a pattern. So again, kind of this idea of a society in the making, right? Even if it's not hegemonic yet. And I would say that because Luxemburg was an internationalist, as was Marx, right? We thought before the internationalism was kind of like a blanket thing. We're all in the same boat, right? But if we think it from this perspective of swerving that is contingent and is rooted in a specific pattern of regularity, then we will have we would force ourselves to think about a network theory, and in a way of connecting different forms of swerving that are slightly different but are basically compatible, that could yield, like could lead to a kind of a international revolution, right? Or like a world revolution in this manner. But it cannot be a form of homogeneity, because that immediately would be a straitjacket, and we would be kind of mimicking the same way we have today of organizing, that we create a thing and it's good, and then everybody has to conform. So what I think the challenge of the swerve and the understanding this idea of change, the swerve as a theory of change, is that we need to think about structures that are dynamic in themselves, and not about things that it should be, like a normative. Normativity needs to be in the practices themselves, and that we need to learn from what is actually happening on the ground, and not from abstract principle. So I think that is the way to think about like coordination among different forms of swerving that are building their own kinds of societies that could kind of communicate and even nationally, regionally, or within even the same country, right? So you can have even local forms of swerving that can be systematized, and different forms of organizations. And I think, again, the ecosystem thinking is necessary, because the plebeian, space is full of different forms of organization that are working class, that they are embedded in neoliberal structures as well. So they have all kinds of problems within and we need to learn from each other in different forms of iteration, right? And not kind of silo, and we very kind of idiosyncratic and very jealous of our own form of being and being in the world in a way. But having a more feedback loop and an iteration between these different forms of swerving that can get us to an optimal, form of swerving for that specific society.
Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Camila, for the talks. Really good, it's great, lot to think about. I'm just wondering, what are some of the material sort of impacts or outcomes of this model? I'm thinking in particular in terms of ownership and markets. Is this model of material constitutionalism intended to promote forms of common ownership? And if so, what role might there be for markets there? Are we looking at some sort of participatory economics? Yeah, so if you could just perhaps expand on some of the implications for markets and ownership, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you. Yes, so the idea of, if we think about the swerve as a new pattern in the making that is counter-hegemonic, anything that is counter-hegemonic to the hegemonic system of the markets and how things work today would be a form of swerving, right? And the idea is to be able to foster that, and not selecting one form, like the common ownership, that's it, right? And having that as the only way, but actually creating bridges between the different forms of counter-hegemonic form of economics, right? That are thought in an interface with the market relations that we have today, because that's what we need to deal with, right? We need to think for the transition. So in a way, the swerving is always connected to the hegemonic structure and how we and the pushback and the back and forth with it, right? So common forms of ownership and the idea of, we have been working with Peter about the energy commons and the idea of commoning and how that interfaces with the structures that are dominant, regulation, right? Markets in general, and how we can build power from it, right? So we can connect the different experiences in order to build power from within, and kind of this swerving being inherently diverse and not choose one model in a way.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks.
I see you, Dave, but I'm going to be rude and call myself first, if that's okay. So I want to ask a question that sounds a bit silly at first, but I hope it's not too silly. I'm thinking about the Matrix, and I'm thinking about when you watch the first Matrix, at the end you go, Neo is the swerve. He's totally going to be this counter-hegemonic force that's going to take down these evil machines, right? But by the time you watch the second and third ones, if you do, but they're a bit crap, but that's the other problem. You realize that, in fact, the swerve was actually designed by the system architect to renew, in fact, the actual logic of the system. So I'm thinking about here the problem of when you have something that feels like a swerve, but it ends up not being a swerve, or it's a swerve that gets redirected. Maybe an example I'm thinking here, something like Project Cybersyn in Chile in the early 70s, where we have, you know, the design of a democratically run network economic planning model, which is a really great idea. But if you look at how it actually was implemented before the coup happened, is that certain tools which we use for communication got adapted, but the overall planning process of how this worked democratically got dropped. So we ended with a very particular thing where something that might have been a swerving moment ended up being not. So like what happens at like different scales when you have like, you know, basically the swerve, not swerve problem?
Yeah, I love the Matrix. Yeah, so basically I would say, and I agree that, you know, I would not say that Neo was the swerve, because, you know, the movement was already happening, right? So basically Neo could not happen. Virtue, if we're thinking about Machiavelli, virtue could not happen. A virtuous leader could not arise in a context that is not propitious in a way. It could arrive, but he's not going to do anything. So the people are already there, you know, moving things, right? And he just kind of like pushes, you know, through, right? So in that way, the more cooperative endeavor than a kind of a leader thing. I would say that from your very dystopian way of seeing it, yes, you know, that at the end, the swerve or Neo was part of the plan, you know, to kind of renew the system from within. This is very kind of Republican in the sense that in Machiavelli speaking, and kind of like the appropriation of Lucretius, is that you're always inside the matrix. There's no way out of the matrix, right? There's always a pattern, there's always a system, and nothing comes, and the first rule of Lucretian thought is nothing comes from nothingness. Nothing comes from thin air, basically. Nothing can just arise. It's always part old and part new, in a way. It's always kind of connected, right? So we cannot really think about the matrix ended and we go to another place that we cannot even imagine, right? It's always connected. So for me, it is the swerve needs to be channeled in a way. The swerve is spontaneity, so you can have channeling or vehicles and institutions, of course, institutions, procedures, everything that could channel this swerving, but you cannot control what the swerve is about. So the only way you have swerves, right? Today we have pushbacks and resistance and modes of alternative cooperation, but those are disaggregated. And they're really not going to bring the system down in a way, and they're not going to renew it in any way. They're just going to survive, you know, and waiting to be phagocytated by the system, right? This is almost like you know, the kind of a very nihilistic way of, you know, resisting, that it will eventually, basically, we will just survive and we will not do much. I would say that the challenge for me is to create this kind of institutions or pattern to allow for that swerve to actually have coherence and to recreate the system in another way, because the matrix cannot be escaped. In a way, how are the basic, you know, configurations of the matrix what we need to be worried about, right? And those cannot be set. And this is the thing, it's not one replacing one matrix with another, or one kind of architect with another architect to do like a better design. Is to actually how to create a matrix that would allow for this dynamic swerving without the need for one architect, in a way, to be choosing who goes where, in a way. I don't know if that makes sense to you. And the sense of, you know, the innovation that comes from technological solutions that seem like something that a breakthrough, that at the end is, again, the biological metaphor is phagocytated. This is what happens with the system. So our capitalist liberal democracies have been very successful at actually branding the revolution for themselves, right? It's like Che Guevara became, you know, the most pop culture icon, even if he wanted to bring the system down, and we just marketize it, right? So in a way, the pattern that we have created with capitalism is very efficient at phagocytating different forms of innovation and preventing them from being autonomous. So one of the things that I didn't mention is autonomy of this, you know, spaces and institutions. So you give the resources, you give the space, and you give the power for people to innovate without any constraints, in a way, only with the constraints that are immanent, in a way, that come from the same practices of equality and cooperation that come from below, in a way, in the praxis itself. So there's, and when we think about innovations that are systemic, are always kind of connected to the system and cannot be allowed. They have patterns, parameters that cannot be escaped. So how the challenge is how to create mechanisms that do not have those parameters and would allow for only limits that would allow for equality and inclusion and dynamism within, right?
Thank you. I think we probably have time for one last question, so I'll hand it over to you, Dave. It better be a good one.
Well, maybe I'll make more of a comment and a brief point than a long and involved question, given the time. Yeah, just I totally agree with Jako's question, and I guess your response that my reading of Marx is very much to develop useful interpretations rather than to argue about whether or not this, that, or the other thing is. Just don't think there's any point getting into those kind of debates. But the point comes down to what you're gonna, what's the purpose of this interpretation? How is it useful? Which I guess builds on the things that Peter has said and Stephen is saying about, and a little bit to what I was touching on earlier is so how does the swerve allow us to say how things will change, or how things that appear to be change are not actually change and are not swerves, you know, building on what Stephen was saying. So whilst I really agree with your defense of you know, maintaining not having a pre-prescribed version of what should be, but rather what maybe could be or what can be. I do think it's very important to kind of be very as developed as we can about saying things that could be or can be that fit with your framework, but also very explicit about what, you know, what cannot constitute a swerve, which you've outlined a lot more in the responses, because this is what really it comes down to, and whether that framework is a useful way of dealing with the problems we have will come down to whether we can very explicitly say, well, this doesn't count because this might appear to be radical, but actually it's still doing all of these things, and this is just recycling the problem. But these things could count. They don't have to be the things, but they could count because they fit with this definition. So it was more a comment than a question, but I think that that's what we need. I mean, that's what I'm interested in when I'm looking at Marx and early writings, is developing a framework that can enable some kind of transition that is meaningful and doesn't get reabsorbed into the system and sold back to you as a t-shirt or whatever, you know. So it's not really a question, but more of a comment. So,
yeah, that's great. I think that is very useful for me in terms of what is not a swerve, because we always focus on, you know, the positive or constructive, but at the end we need to be more analytical in terms of how this is, you know, used and understood, right? 2 seconds comment. We were in the AHM conference, and there was a guy, I don't remember his name, that he was talking about counter-hegemony and counter-hegemonic spaces, but that it could be non-plebeian, non-Marxist, but they're part of, you know, this kind of pluralist understanding of counter-hegemonic tendencies. And I'm like, well, this is not really, you know, what hegemony really means in a way, right? It's like how you don't need to create those spaces. You need to have a contrast. You cannot be part of the same thing. It's not you're hegemonic. You're innovative within the hegemonic structure, but you cannot really utilize that language to talk about, for example, capitalism, right? And kind of the ways that capitalism innovates, right? So what is not a swerve is, I think, it's a good thing that I will include for sure. So thank you so much for that.
Cool. Well, I think we can maybe take that as a good, not ending point, but a pausing point, and we'll keep thinking about this and keep discussing it. And thank you very much for that, Camila.
Thank you for organizing and everybody for coming. Thank you so much.